Welcome to Raven Talk, the official podcast of the Raven Tribe. The Raven Tribe is a home for warriors on the path, and is dedicated to training warriors for the battlefield of life. Visit us on the web at theraventribe.com, where you can learn more information on membership, warrior training, as well as links to our official YouTube channel, Facebook group, apparel store, and our official bookstore, Marshall Books.
Welcome back, Tribe. Today we're here with special guest Bruce Aller, fencing instructor, and our guest co-host, Chad McBroom. Bruce, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, actually.
Good to hear, Bruce. Well, Bruce, for the audience at home who may not be familiar with you, I would ask you to do us a favor and give us a little bit of a background about yourself, how you got involved in the martial arts and fencing specifically.
Okay, I started... The first martial art I took, I started some Taekwondo in 1973, and then shortly after that, the same year, I switched to Japanese style of karate. But at the same time, I started European fencing, and I've been doing the Western arts ever since. And when I was in college, I also took some judo.
Now, Bruce, when you say fencing, you are not referring to modern sport fencing. You're actually training, correct my terminology if I'm wrong, but in more of classical fencing and historic fencing, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you
the fencing can go a number of different ways. You know, it's depending. You can go into sport fencing. You can treat it as a martial art, or you can do like theatrical fencing. And, you know, you can flip-flop back and forth between all of them. But I deal with it as a martial art. But I occasionally can compete in competition. But that gets you're dealing with a whole different mindset with that.
Now, Bruce, can you share with us a little bit about what the area of fencing is that you specialize in? Do you work with the Italian schools, French, Spanish? What type of fencing are we talking about here?
Well, the style that I teach is Southern Italian and that. But I also work with in earlier periods I work Italian rapier. I'm working on a Bolognese sword fighting from the 16th century. And I do Italian and German longsword from the 15th century. And then I'm also working on different forms of British silver from 1599 and Highland broadsword, and there's a few other authors in there that we're working from.
Now, Bruce, for the audience at home, I would wager that a lot of people don't know the difference between even if we could just start with something simple like the types of weapons that are looked at in fencing. It's not just one universal type of sword that's worked with. Tell us a little bit about the different weapons, you know, where they come from, what time period, what culture, and specifically looking at the ones that you focus on.
Yeah, I'm losing you.
Oh,
can you speak up just a little bit?
Sure. No,
my hearing's not what it used to be.
No problem. What I was asking was if you could do us a favor and just explain to us a little bit about the differences in the different types of weapons that you train in fencing.
Oh,
it's not just
okay.
one sword. Tell us where, you know, what the different swords are, where they come from, and how they're used.
Well, most of the swords, they're kind of generic for all of Europe, and it goes by time periods. But I'm not going to go way back. I'm going to go back to around 1300, and that was like a single-handed cutting sword, but you could thrust with it as well. It was most of them were double. They had a double edge and a point. Later on, you also had some that were one-edged with a point and maybe like a clip and on the other side, or a false edge, and with just a plain cross. As time went on, some of the blades got longer. Those were the long swords. A long sword still could be used with one hand, but it's still a cruciform sword, so it's like a cross. then you get into the late 15th century, they started adding on little things on the guard to protect the hand a little. They discovered that if you put your finger, your pointing finger, over the cross guard, you got a lot more accuracy with your point. But the problem is, if you parry and the blade comes sliding down, or your opponent's blade comes sliding down yours, where's it going to land? Right on your finger. So they started adding a little protection for the finger. And then they started adding more protection to cover the back of the hand, the bottom of the hand. Pretty soon you had a really complex guard, and but the sword itself was still straight, double-edged with a point. And as time went on, that guard got even more closed, and then they started using more, in Eastern Europe, they were using more curved blades. So that's where a lot of the saber stuff comes from. Although the technique for both of the cutting, it's a cutting sword, and it's going to work the same whether it's a straight blade or a curved blade. Well, the curved blade when you hit, it's going to draw a little differently. The straight one, it's not going to draw the same way across and open up the wound. But you're delivering the cut the same way.
Now,
and
Bruce, are we
you can
still
still
talking?
thrust with it, even if it's curved. You just won't look where your point's going. You don't pay attention to the curve.
Now, are we still talking battlefield swords at this point in history, Bruce?
Yeah, it's mostly if you go way back, you had swords that were geared a little more towards civilian use than battlefield, but mostly it was battlefield. When you start getting into the rapier era, rapiers aren't that hot on the battlefield. They're too dependent on time, and they're thin blades, so if somebody comes in with something really heavy, it's probably going to push right through your blade or break it. And that. So when you're getting into the late 16th century, well, that's also in the 16th century is where you're starting to get more and more civilians practicing swordsmanship, and that in the cities and that in Europe, particularly in Italy. And so now when they're developing the rapier, they still had what's called we call it the side sword. But it's kind of like a broadsword with a more complex hilt. But you had that side by side with the rapier. You'd use the side sword on the battlefield more. The rapier was for more dueling or street defense. And the rapier, eventually, the French developed a small sword from the rapier. The Italians continued to use a rapier. And the Italian rapier, it was always longer. the French small sword, it shrunk down to, roughly speaking, 32 inches in length. And the Italians were still using 30, 37, 38, 39, 40 inches long, up right into the 19th century. So when they started, the blade that we use now for most of the fencing is 35 inches. They decided at the end of the 19th century, when they started getting more and more international competition, they decided we have to come up with a standard length blade. So they decided, let's go with 35 inches. The French liked the short blade, the Italians liked the long blade. They went with something somewhat in the middle. And that's how we got the 35-inch blade now.
Nice. Now, Bruce, I wanted to ask you, and Chad, if you could chime in here, because Chad and I have discussed this a lot. We are not sword practitioners, but we definitely look at fencing as a resource for understanding the dynamics of blade combat, because Chad and I both dedicate a lot of time to edge weapons. And you and I have trained together, and we've exchanged ideas. But one of the things that I've always found really interesting is how comprehensive the understanding of blade work and mechanics of combat are that are to be found in the Western sword traditions. tell us some of the things, because you've done some cross training, you've seen, martial arts from other, backgrounds other than Western swordsmanship. Well, what are some of the things that you found most useful as far as the tactics and the philosophy behind some of the Western sword arts?
It's the judgment and use of distance and timing. That's one of the things that seems to be pretty consistent for all of them is knowing where the proper distance is to start your attack, where you want to stand so that you have time to see what's coming so you can defend. I think for me that's the most critical issue. Understanding time and place. That's the way Silver put it. Know the place.
Gotcha. Now, Bruce, one of the things that I took away from reading some of the sword manuals and from talking to instructors that work with the swords, and you mentioned was the distance, but also the time. And the concept of time is very different in Western sword work, the way it's expressed and understood. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's an area I found very interesting, and it really helped me to kind of elevate my understanding of the blade, even though it wasn't with swords, but it helped overall.
Yeah. So I think George Silver, from 1599, I think he put it probably the best as there's the time of the hand in the body, the time of the hand in the body and the foot, and the time of the hand, the body, and feet. And in more recent fencing, last 300 years, we designate one time is fencing is divided into times, and one time would be like a lunge or a parry. It's the time it takes to do one single fencing action. And with Silver, he goes the time of the hand. So if you're looking at a lunge, in modern fencing terminology, that would be one time, but it's a long time. So with Silver, he would divide that up into the time of the hand, the body, and the foot, because the hand is moving first, followed by the body, and then the foot. And so when an attack is coming in, if the attack is coming in up to the time of the hand, body, and foot, if you can parry it with just the time of the hand, you've got a lot of space in there to pick it up in that. If you're trying to if the attack is coming, here we're getting into distance too. So if I'm standing close enough where you can hit me by just extending your hand, that's close distance. And normally you don't want to get in close distance unless you're actually launching an attack. You don't want to stand there waiting to defend because of the time of the hand is so fast, chances are you're going to be late, or if you're really good you may catch it, but it's more of a gunfight and that. Does that all make sense yet or no?
It does. And I want to ask you, Bruce, if we can explain a little bit to the audience listening. The times that Silver outlines, they're not just times for yourself to understand of when to attack and when to move, but it also helps you to read the other opponent. I remember working out with a guy, and I could hit him whenever I felt like it. And the reason was because he would move with his feet before anything else would move. And he was just very clearly telegraphing what his intentions were. And so he's violating one of those. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how Silver breaks that down?
Yeah, those are the incorrect times because he's moving the foot first. The hand should always go first. So it should always go in that order: the hand, the body, the foot, or the feet. And when we say the feet, it's in the case of modern fencing, it would be advanced lunge. In the case of the more historical stuff, it would be on a passing attack and that. So, yes. Now I lost my train of thought.
Well, let me go on to my next question, Bruce. Something you touched upon was the distancing, and I wanted to know if you could do us a favor and just kind of give a synopsis of the concept of measure and how it's used in fencing, because I think it's really well understood in fencing, much more so I think than in a lot of other arts. And especially you see this a lot in combat sports like boxing. They tend to still understand that, but I think it's lost in some other arts. Can you share with us some thoughts on measure?
Yeah. In fact, I just mentioned close distance. That's one of the three measures that we're looking at. So close distance is where you can hit your opponent by just extending your hand and reaching out and hitting them. Measure is the distance where in modern fencing you can reach your opponent with a lunge, but so it's a little longer time to get to him, but you're a little safer because he can't just reach out and touch you. He has to lunge to hit you, and which will give you time to make your defense. Then there's out of measure, which is advance and lunge. So it's going to entail the opponent to take more time to get to you. It'll also take you more time to get to him, but that's the time where you're gonna do something like a feint. So you're coming in with the attack. You know he's gonna parry, so you feint. He parries. You disengage around it, and then you hit him. So you're using that time, and you're trying to get your opponent to open up to give you an extra time. That's what the feint is all about. You're creating more time for yourself to get an attack in. But it's the measure is the distance it takes to hit your opponent with a lunge. And usually when you're fencing, you want to stay out of measure. So you're giving yourself the most time to make a defense if your opponent attacks.
Now, Chad,
and then you're always training how to get to close that distance between you and your opponent with you're training with footwork so you can close that distance fast. But he's still going to have the opportunity to defend, so you're going to work around his defense.
Now, Bruce, my understanding is that a sound fencer will always be out of measure unless they are enacting their game plan. Is that the correct way of looking at it?
Yeah, you're going to stay out of measure until you're attacking. You're not going to get into, because if you the closer you get to your opponent, the easier it is for him to hit you. So you want to make it as hard for him to get you as possible. So you're going to watch your distance. You're going to stay out of measure. Usually, the way I look at it is, I'll go on guard and with the swords crossed about 6 inches, because that's at that distance nobody can actually hit you with a lunge. They have to advance lunge to get you, unless they're really tall and you're short.
Gotcha. Chad, are you still with us there? I think we lost Chad, but that's okay. So, Bruce, now let me ask you this. You've done training with people of a variety of different arts, different weapon styles. The fencing is something I think that a lot of people in the martial arts may think of something like fencing as very abstract or very classical and not having a lot of application for modern use. What are your thoughts on that? Having cross-trained with people, I mean, I know my thoughts on it. I can share them with you, but I'd like to see what where you chime in on it. I mean, is fencing something that's just a preservation of something historic, or is there modern application for what you're doing?
I think for me the modern application is, like we're talking, with understanding the concepts of timing and distance, measure. Because if somebody's attacking you, if you don't let them get close, they can't hit you. But if you get too far away, then you can't strike back if you wanted to. And I think it's the distance and timing. Those concepts, I think, are really applicable to any situation. You know, don't let your opponent get too close. Keep an eye on them. You know, just the general, you know, combat stuff of attack and defense and stuff like that. You're and you know, you build up confidence and all. So I think it is applicable.
Bruce, now one thing that I've noticed is a universal truth to all advanced practitioners of any martial art that I've worked with, is that the real advanced practitioners that have a good understanding of what their art is, they all have a good understanding of angles and how to use angles for both attack and defense. What are some of the things that one can learn from fencing in regards to proper angle of attack and defense?
Oh, yeah. So a lot of times with the modern fencing, it's mostly like a straight attack, but the angles are coming in with the defense. So just starting with the modern fencing, working back, when the attack is coming in straight, you're defending, your parries become an angle, and you're taking it offline. So, and in fact, historically, they always used to explain fencing with geometry and that. Now, there's also, you can attack, nowadays we're fencing linear, but you can also move off the line of attack. You can, if the attack is coming in straight, you can sidestep. So some of the actions that they used, and it's still in the fencing system, is incartadas, which is stepping off the line as the attack comes in. You're stepping off the line at a 45-degree angle backwards, so the attack goes past, and then you're just extending into the attacker and closing the line so he can't hit you. An Italianata is the same thing somewhat. You're going off in the opposite direction forward. The Incartada is going backwards at an angle. The Italianata is going forward is at an angle, but you're going offline. There's also a scanso de vita where you're sidestepping offline. The French version of the Incartada is a demi-volte, and that one, the footwork is a little different, but you're doing the same thing. You're stepping offline and kind of counterattacking at the same time. With broadsword, you could counter it, or you could do your initial attack angular. So you're not coming in straight in. You're stepping diagonally forward to the right or to the left, and you're bringing your attack in that way. And usually, and you can also step offline, like in Meyer's footwork, when you're parrying, you're kind of doing like a pivot offline on the front foot.
Now,
and you can go ahead.
Oh, no, you mentioned Meyer, and I want to take that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the other things that are involved with these systems. Meyer's a good example. Meyer, covers a variety of different weapons, and one of the weapons I think most applicable to modern self-defense is the dagger. Tell me a little bit about your understanding of dagger in general. I mean, I know you've worked with Meyer. I don't know if you've worked with the Fiore material, but tell us a little bit about the daggers, how they worked, and how we can still apply that today.
Yeah, the daggers were the daggers that Meyer was using, and the ones in Fiore's time and that. Those were really they weren't so much of a cutting weapon as they were kind of like more of an ice pick kind, or a thrusting weapon. They were more thrusting. They were thin and long and that. But at the same time as Meyer, that's when it was starting to change. So in Italy, they're starting to use, in some cases, slightly shorter blades, and they were slashing with them as well. But if somebody's coming in with a lot of Meyer's techniques and with Fiore in that, if somebody's coming in, like let's say somebody picks up a screwdriver, great big old screwdriver, and comes in, you can use it against that. If they're going to try and hit you with a hammer, you can use it against that. So the defenses, and a lot of the defenses would work against a punch as well. And then you could go right into a lot of it. It's, you do the initial defense, grabbing their arm and locking it, after that, you can go into grappling. A lot of the techniques are grappling, and they're arm locks and stuff like that, joint locks, shoulder locks. You can blow out their shoulder. You can wreck their, if it's somebody that's really intending on doing you some harm, you can really do a lot of damage to them. Blow their elbow out, their shoulder.
Now, Bruce, you mentioned that the dagger used in Meyer and Fiore is more of a thrusting weapon or a stabbing weapon. And I've known people that have looked at this material, and they're coming from a perspective of modern knife work where they're used to a very nimble cutting and thrusting weapon. Tell us a little bit about, there's a reason why that was a thrusting weapon. Can you kind of put it in a historical perspective for us?
Yeah, because at the time, most people were wearing, they weren't going around in T-shirts. They had a heavy linen shirt, they had a wool singlet or a wool doublet, and usually it was lined as well. So they're wearing a lot of material. If you just start slashing away at it, you may get through a little bit or you may not. But if you come down with like an ice pick, that's going to penetrate. And sometimes they would wear chainmail underneath as well, underneath their doublet. So in order to penetrate the amount of clothing that they were wearing, you needed a powerful strike with the point. The edge didn't do much against what they were wearing.
And that makes a lot of sense. Now, Bruce, another area that is an area of interest for you is historical reenactments, and specifically military reenactments. What, if any, insights have you pulled away from the reenactment world as it applies to understanding your combat training with the edge weapons? I would imagine that looking at all of these different military campaigns and events you would glean some insight into either the use of the weapon or just the overall larger context of what was going on at the time.
Well, yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that people don't think about is a lot of times, right up through the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, a lot of the units were, they're standing shoulder to shoulder, and the second rank is close enough to put your palm on the shoulder of the rank in front of you, and the third rank can do the same thing with the second rank. So everybody's packed in pretty tight. So there's not a lot of swinging you're going to be doing with your weapons. It's going to be thrusting, and in some cases you can't even do a lot of that. It depends on the formations. As the art of the bayonet developed, that developed with the light troops that were in skirmishing order out in front of the battalions and that. The battalions, they really didn't want them doing a lot of parry and riposte when they're in line, because you're going to be whacking the person next to you. If you're in a tight formation and somebody thrusts at you, you parry it, you're going the guy next to you is going to take it, because you're going to parry it right into him. And so they didn't really try to train the people to do a lot of close combat in formation. Any combat that you did was after the formation broke up. And historically speaking, you can't find any official military training for close combat weapons prior to the 19th century. It was all, now this is my opinion, but I think it was probably like senior people in the unit, or like NCOs and that, or maybe the officer would hire a local fencing master to teach the people some stuff. But there was no official government of any government of how to train the close combat stuff. Even with the cavalry with the saber, none of that stuff was really, it started showing up at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, and from then on it started to build more and more and more, and the government started, the different governments started getting more involved with the training of close combat. But up until around 1800, I think it was pretty much up to the individual soldier to get their own training. They got trained in how to use the musket, and they got trained in how to march, and because keeping the formation was critical. You know, if like let's say you're on an 18th century battlefield, and if you try to use like a modern infantry formation, the cavalry's going to just run you right down. Because to firing, you had one shot and then you had to reload, and so you had to rely on the formation staying tight. Then the cavalry wouldn't charge it. They could charge up to it, shoot into it, but unless you gave them big openings that they could get through, they're not going to hit you.
Now, Bruce, the military training, as opposed to the civilian training, can you tell us, once the military started to train their soldiers, was there a marked difference in the way that the individuals were trained in comparison to training that they may receive in a civilian school of fencing?
Yeah, it was. You know, it's just like training the military today. You're trying to teach them what you can, but you got so many people you're dealing with that the bayonet it's mostly like sword and bayonet drills in the 19th century, and they're pretty rudimentary. You're learning basic attacks, you're learning basic defense, and you're learning some footwork along with it. But they don't they don't go into all the different options that you would have. You can do this, you could do that. You know, if you and mostly they didn't do too much with feints, because on the battlefield with feinting it implies you have time to make a feint. On the battlefield you don't always have time. It's just, I think William Hope put it the best. He said when fighting in a crowd, he says, just keep cutting and parry everything that comes at you. And I think that was from like 1713 he said that.
Oh, good insight. Now, Bruce, bayonets are something that interests me a lot. I'm very interested in the way that they're used, the training programs that different militaries create for the bayonets. I'm not sure how far your study of the bayonet goes as far as in time. I don't know if it goes into the modern time, but if you do have some insights regarding the different ways that bayonets were used, I'd love to hear them, because I know that I've looked at recently modern military manuals from World War I moving forward, and there's definitely different vibes and different ways of doing things with the bayonet. Some look very much based on some fencing principles, and others tend to break away from that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
Any insights on bayonet training?
So all of the bayonet stuff that I've looked at so far, up to like 1914, is pretty much based on fencing. But then when you get, as a result of World War I, everything you're looking at after 1917, 1918, it's like the emphasis shifts from a fencing position to a boxing position. And now you're coming in at more of instead of coming on guard with the point forward, and with your right hand, it'd be along by your right hip, and then your left hand would be what you got your left side forward. After 1918 and that, it's more a high prime, and you're slashing with the bayonet. You could slash with the bayonet. It's thrusting, butt strokes, and a couple of parries. But there is a big change, and I think it's because the experience on the battlefield in World War I. You weren't marching across the battlefield anymore. If you're going across the battlefield, you're running, and you're hitting the enemy at a run. So it's the boxing position will work better for it. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Now, Bruce, have you looked at the Stiers and Biddle method of bayonet fencing?
The which one?
Stiers and Biddle.
No, I haven't.
Okay, because I know that during World War II there were some different camps teaching close quarter combat to the armed forces, and their approach tends to, from my view, it looks like they draw a lot more from fencing traditions, because their system is.
Oh, okay, that'd be interesting. I gotta see that.
Yeah, That's why I was asking you, if, what the where the change may have occurred. But no, that's an interesting insight. I never thought about that. The difference in just the way that soldiers moved, as opposed to, from a formation march to, kind of darting across the battlefield.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got a number of bayonet books. I've got like maybe four or five from after 1918, and I got a whole bunch from earlier. And the most of the early ones were really consistent. No matter what nationality they were from, they were pretty consistent. There's small differences, but then when it changes, it seems pretty consistent again what they changed into.
Now, Bruce, I remember speaking to you at an event that we were at, and you shared some interesting insights regarding naval warfare and the swords, and you shared some ideas that you had about how they were used when they were boarding ships and some of the differences. Can you share some of those details? I think they were really interesting, and I think they really go towards explaining how environment really dictates usage for weapons in general.
Yeah. So the boarding weapons that they used, it was cutlasses, boarding pikes. Those were the primary ones, and they had boarding axes. But there's kind of the debate, were the boarding axes primarily for fighting, or were they for like clearing debris and stuff like that as a result of all the cannon fire? But anyhow, those were the three main weapons. And then they used the belaying pins as well, and daggers, and the officers had small. Well, but the side repelling the boarders would line up along the rail or just a little back from it, and they'd be in a formation. But because you got like rigging all over the place, you can't swing all over. You've got ropes along the deck, so you can't do a lot of movement, footwork. So you're kind of really restricted as to how much you can move, and that. So when the boarders would swing across and hit, they would attack the first line and get parried, and then they would just move back to the second line. The first line of the defenders, they weren't necessarily going to repost. They're just going to parry. They're going to stop the attack, and then as the person rolled back behind them, the next rank it was their job to take them out. And it kind of worked the same way from the defenders or the attackers as well. They'd hit and roll in, and everything was done really tight. And the officers, if they had small swords, their guard positions were their hands were held in really tight, and so their point was down or up or across. You're not going to keep your guard out like you would if you're going up against another swordsman on an open field. You're going to keep it down because this cutlass coming down is going to just probably knock it out of your hand, or just knock it out of the way and then come in. So you're going to keep it down, but keeping it as a threat. But you're still using this is a situation where you were in a formation and you were fighting in a tight formation, but the front rank was just defending, and the second rank was the ones supposed to be doing the damage. That's based on a letter from a Royal Navy officer to an older officer to a younger officer, kind of giving him some ideas of how to do it. And later in the 19th century, the cutlass exercises were pretty much the same as the cavalry saber exercises. Using the same cuts, the same parries. But earlier, I think it was more interesting earlier, and they probably did a lot more boarding earlier.
Very interesting. Well, Bruce, that's about all the time that we have today. I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. And before we go, can you please tell the audience at home, if they're interested in delving into the world of fencing, if they want to come check you out for your classes or have you out for a workshop at their schools, how can they reach out to you?
Okay. I'm on Facebook. It's Bruce Michael Aller, if you want to find me on Facebook. And my email address is brucemAller@hughes.net.
Great. Well, thank you, Bruce, again for being on the show. I really enjoyed it, and we definitely got to get together and train again sometime real soon.
Definitely.